Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode. Alright, hope you're all doing okay. So, in the last episode, we worked on creating helper methods for CLI UI. Okay, so let's look at what we did. So, created the CLI helper class and we included some static methods, readline and writeline. So, we use readline to read a value from the CLI. Okay, and we use writeline to write a value to the CLI. So the read line has some extra features. Okay, so we are enhancing the native read line that we have from PHP. So native read line from PHP just gives us a way to read a value and pass a label, okay, which is optional. Okay, and it will read a value. If you don't put a value, it will return an empty string, and if you put a value, it would return that value. However, we want a way where we must provide a label to read line, so we don't want to make it optional, so that the user knows what they need to provide. And we also want to give the user a way to make a field or an input required. Okay, so what that means is that if you set this as true, then you must provide a value, else it will keep repeating that form for you till you provide the value. Okay, so here we have an infinite loop. Okay, and we're setting the display name. So if it's required, we're going to add this required annotation or tag to the label. If not, we just put the label there, and then we have a variable to receive that input. We get the value. Of course, we pass our label in here, and we trim the value to ensure that we don't have blank spaces. Okay, and once we do that, we check to see if it's required. So if it's not required, okay, then we go into this scope. However, if this is not true, or if this is true, then we just return that. However, if it's not true, we check to see if the value is empty. If the value is not empty, okay, and if it's not empty, then we return this. So basically what we are doing here is we check to see if this is not required. So if it's not required, we go into the scope. However, if it is required, we check to see if the value is not empty. Okay, if it's not empty, then we go into the scope. Okay, but if any of this condition isn't met, then we print this message to the user that the value is required. Please try again, and then we go back to the start of the loop. Okay, and here what we are doing is we are checking to see if the value provided is empty. Okay, if it's an empty string, then we return null, but if it's not an empty string, then we return the input just as is, right? Okay, and then we have writeline, which basically just echoes the value and add a new line to it. So we could use this in various places that we have echo here. So we could do something like let's say CLI helper writeline, and then there will be no need to do this. It will be fine. So you could choose to rename or to refactor places where we have this echo and replace them with calls to this. Yeah. Alright. So today in this episode we're going to do some kind of form builder. Okay, so let's imagine this use case, right? So let's say we need to get a few values from the user. Let's say we need to get the name, the email, let's say email and password. Right? Now, thanks to this, thanks to the extra params we have in our readline function, what we can do is we could, if we want to say this required, we could just pass true and true, and then we could dump our values. So let me do that. Email password. Right. Okay, so let's receive that value. So let's say clear php main.php name required. So let's put blank. Need to provide that. So let's see tremendous email. Let's see tremendous at mian.net, and password. Let's see catch me at 321. Let's say something like that. So we have our values here. So what we are trying to do is we want to create something like a form builder that allows us to provide options for our form, and then we want the CLI to build the form for us and return the values, okay, as per how we defined the input in the form. Okay, so I want to have a way where we can see form equals to an array like this, and we can specify our field. So we can say name, and then we can provide some options to that. So we could say label. The label would be name. Let's say is required would be, let's say, true, for example. And then we can have for email and for password. Okay, and then we want to be able to call some function. Let's say data. Let's say build load form or something, or generate form, something like that, and we'll provide this form do we call it form config or form let's see, we call it form values or form config. Let's call it form config. So pass that form config, and then here we would like to have the values in an array similar to this. So we want to have, let's see, name, and then whatever the user provided as name. So let's say Andromedas. Then let's say email. So let's say we have name, email, label can be email address, and we can have password. Then we pass this as password, right? So let's say label password, and is required, let's say true, right? And then at the end we can have something like this. Let's say email, let's enter address here, and password, let's see So I want to be able to call such a function. We pass our form configuration, and then it should generate this data for us, okay, from the value. Maybe we could call it load form or build form or something like that. Okay. Alright, so that's our task for this episode. So let's do that. Okay, so first we're going to create a method in our CLI function. We're going to make it stat CLI class, CLI helper class, sorry. Function, we'll call it generate form or build form or load form. Let's see, we got execute form. I'll just call it load form for now, or read form. Yeah, read form. Naming is hard in programming. Okay, so if we say generate form, it's from the function. It feels like it would generate the form, but not necessarily load the data from the form. I want to have something that gives a way to, that indicates that this would be something that gets or that expects a value and will return a form, will return the data from the form. Okay, so maybe we can call it display, or yeah, let's call it render form. Yeah, this makes sense. So here we receive an array, so call it form config, and this will return an array in the shape. So it will receive an object like this, and it would return something like this. Alright, so let's do that. Alright, so first we need to check if our form is an empty object. Right, so let's check. So if is empty, so there's nothing in the form config, then we won't return anything. So we could throw an error here. Let's say right line, let's say empty form config, right? Then we will return an empty array, or we could return null, which would indicate that okay, this is an invalid value. All right, so we want to loop through the elements of this form and get our form. So for each element in the form, we would render the form data, right? So first, let's make sure that we have the right form data. So let's do for each. Let's say for each form config as form field, or let's say field config. Okay, so with this will print the each configuration, if so for each field, so each field in the form, and then the value would be the configuration for that field. So an example, this would be the field, and this would be the configuration for the field. All right, So let's do a check. First we'll check to see if there are any errors if we have the wrong form configuration. As long as there is a field, we will set a default value in there. Right, so let's do that. So let's check what object this is. Okay, so let's check if is array. So if is array, so if it's not an array, if this is not an array, then we would try an error. So CLI helper. Okay, we are here, so we just need to do self outline invalid config for, let's bring the name of the field, yeah, and then we return null. Yeah, so let's see if that works. Right, so let's see, let's scuttle this, and let's introduce something here. Let's see, pin, then let's see, we pass null, or maybe we'll pass an object. Yeah, but let's pass null for now, and let's call CLI helper render form. Okay, let's comment this out, and let's see what we get from data. All right, okay, so okay, yeah, so let's comment this as well. Comment on this. Right. Okay, so we have an empty form config. That's because we've not passed in a value, but we have passed in a value. So let's see. We shouldn't have empty form config here. Render form. Let's see if our condition is correct. Oh yeah, sorry, if this is empty, yes. Right, so we have invalid config for pin because pin doesn't have an array. Okay, so what if we pass in an array? What happens? Okay, so here return value must be, well, this is because we haven't returned anything from the function. Okay, but notice it accepted pin. Okay, even though the configuration value is empty. At the very least, we should have a label for the pin. Okay, so this is one of the advantages of a class. So you could have a class to represent the configuration, and then pass that configuration, pass an instance of the class to this. Okay, so we could enforce that you must provide a label, and we don't have to do the check here. We have to do the check here, right? So so here we have to check label equals config, then we try to pass the label, we try to look for this for a value with this key, okay, in the config object. So let's see what we have when we do this. So let's dump that. Okay, so we have undefined array key label, so we don't have this. We don't want to have a warning. We should check if this key exists before we try to retrieve it. So what we can do is we can do if array key exists. I think we will pass, if I can remember, is it the array we pass first or the key? I'm not sure. But let's try that. So let's do if it doesn't exist, and we do self right line, no label found for field name, for field. Let's have some exclamation here and there, and then we return null, right? Sorry about that. Alright, so let's see what we have here. Okay, we have something. Okay, so no label found for pin. That's good. Now for is required. Now this, we want to make it optional because you don't have to provide that in a readline function. It's optional. So what we'll do is we would check if it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, then we'll set a null value to it. Okay, so we can do if array key doesn't exist. So we'll say is required config. So if it doesn't exist, then we will set it on the config object. So set is required, right, to false. Okay, now what if it exists? We need to check what is in there. Okay, so if it exists, let's check that. So we'll see is required equals config is required, or what we can do is we can say is bool, right? I think we have such a function. So if whatever is in here is bool, that it's a boolean field, right? If it's a boolean field, then we assign it to the config object. So we'll say config. We might also want to check to see if label is not null. Would also want to check that. So maybe we could do okay, but there is a label. I want to check. We could do let's see. Yeah, we could do a different check. Okay, so let's do this first. So if what is here is a boolean, then we'll store it directly into this, but if it's not, then we just set it to false. Now if the label exists, we want to do a check for that, so we'll say else. So we can say let's do if so let's say if is string, I think. So if it's a string, config let's say label, right, goes to config config label. Okay, so config label, then we can say if is string label. Okay, for string label, so if it's not a string, or we trim it and it's empty, right, then we are going to throw an error, right line, invalid, let's see, label for field is invalid, or is, let's see, is empty or invalid. Yeah, let's do something like that, and return no. But if it's not, then we proceed to this section. Right, so with this we'll have our label, and we'll have is required. Okay, we should store, okay, yeah, we don't need to do this, we already have it here, so that's fine. We might want to trim it though, so let's see. Yeah, I might want to trim it just to be sure. We don't have any unnecessary values, so we could say let's do the trim here again just to be sure. Yeah, so it's required, right. Right, so with this we are sure of our configuration, and so once we do that, we could store it back into the config object by saying form config, why not, let's do updated form config. Okay, so we'll say let's call it valid form config. Yeah, so let's say valid form config, right? So say valid form config field equals array, and we as the label, which would be what we have in label, and is required, which is what we have in required. Great. So with this, we've validated validate form fields here. That's what we're doing. Here we are validating form config. Right. So from here we could focus on rendering the form. So render the form. So that would be for each valid form config as field config, and then we'll have so we'll just do here, we'll have form data. So this is where we'll store the data we got from the form. I'll say form data field equals self read line. We'll pass the label, which we'll have in config config label, and then we'll pass the is required, which we have in config is required. Right. And then once we do that, we could return our form data. Right, so let's check that. Okay, so we have an issue on line 40. Where is that? 40. Okay, we didn't end this. We also have in line 49. Let's see line 49. What did we do? Is bool is required. Syntax error, supposed to have an end line. Okay, yeah, so if this is bool, right, if it's a boolean, then we store the value there. So we'll say config is required, else we store false. Right, so this is on line 54. Yeah, there should be an equal sign. Yes. Right, no label found for pin, so this works. So let's put a wrong value. Let's not include a label. Let's say meow fish. Okay, so no label found for pin, so we need to include a label. So let's include a label. Let's put a null value. Okay, so label for pin is invalid or empty. Let's put an array. Great, invalid and empty. Let's put a blank string. Okay, invalid and empty. So let's say pin. Transaction pin. Or you know what? Let's include some white spaces. Let's try to be smart. It didn't work. Let's leave it transaction pin. Okay, so you can see that it didn't prompt for missing is required because we have a way of setting a default value if none was provided, which we are doing here. So let's do here. So let's say check if config for field is valid, config data for field is valid, check if label, check label. Okay, so let's do validate label. Normalize is required. Okay. Let's do check if field is required, and implement default where necessary. Okay, update form config with validated form field data, or let's say config. Yeah. Okay, so let's run it again. Oh yeah, let's make sure we do a var dump on the data we get here. So let's do var dump data. Right, so let's execute that. So for name is required, let's do Andromedas. Let's say pin. Let's not put pin. You can see pin doesn't have the required, so we can skip it. Email address, we can't skip it, we need to provide. So let's say andromedas@meow.net. And password is required, we can skip it. So let's say meow@321. Right, you can see we have the name, we have the pin, which is null, we have an email, and we have the password. Okay, so this should help us where we need to generate a form, right? Okay, so this would be part 2 for CLI helper. Okay, and maybe in the next episode we're going to refactor this config to use classes to make it more nice to work with. Okay, all right, so see you guys in the next episode.